nowadays, and I work predominantly as a student of arms. I study either the production or the design and manufacture of items. And over about the last 10 to 12 years, I've accidentally fallen down the rabbit hole of single-edged arms, which is nowadays my area of speciality.
Well, great. So you're going to talk.
Sorry?
I said you're going to talk to us about single-edged arms today, right? And it looks like you have some original sitting there.
Yeah, it's a remarkable concept, actually talking about what I know. So what I am doing in my research work is roughly 10 years ago, as I say, I was younger and even stupider, and spending time on the internet. And I'd been working as a craftsman for a couple of years at that point, so I thought I knew a bit. And now, sorry, hang on, I'm getting a notification. Am I getting problems? We're getting a bit of interference going on here. I hope you can hear me okay. People at the time were always talking about, or in a discussion about falchions being heavy axe-like cleavers. And I'd been looking at some of the data on the Conyers falchion at the time, and I'd come up with details of its thickness, and I knew that this was an incredibly thin weapon, much narrower than most people assumed. And these sort of cliches of a heavy axe-like object were misleading, to say the least. And somebody swore blind that I was wrong. I was obviously an idiot because they're axes, because it says so in popular media. And in a fit of belligerence, I decided that the best solution to this would be to do a bit of looking into these and make a web page. And it'd probably only take me a week or two. Yeah, here I am 10 years later. So it would be fair to say that the rabbit hole was considerably deeper than I thought it was. And at the time, nobody had been doing any research work at all on the subject of single-edged arms. They were pretty much glossed over entirely in Oakeshott. And I learned later that somebody who knew him had once commented that the reason he didn't do any single-edged arm typology was they were so complex that he couldn't work out how to do it. If I'd known that at the time, I think I probably wouldn't have started what I was doing. But hindsight is a wonderful mistress, so here I am now again. Part of the problem with single-edged arms not having been researched is that there is a lack of understanding of the objects. There is also a lack of terminology for them. So much of my early work has been in setting up and establishing a typology to try to be able to understand these objects, because previously there were phrases like clip, pointed, and cusped, and that was about it. And there is one publication on falchions, which is La Storta by Herbert Seitz, and that's it. 12 pages, and it's bilingual. It could be best described as having the Blues Brothers of falchions. It has both country and Western. And this was definitely lacking. So I've had to do quite a bit of initial work to try to create a framework which people can use universally. And my intention through that has been to tie it in with Oakeshott's work, because it's at least familiar to most people who are students of medieval arms to some degree or another. I'm now going to try and switch to a set of screen shares if I'm lucky, which will be able to talk my way through some of this. Let's see if this works.
Apparently it's not.
Or apparently not. We need a technical difficulties screen here, don't we? There we go, that's it.
It's not what you
No,
think it is.
no, that's the one we need.
It's not what you think it is.
Oh, okay. No, that's the one I think it is. Yeah, go on, that one. Right, so we started with a blank slate on the subject, and I tried to set up a series of criteria for a proposed typology, that it was simple enough that it could be easily learned and remembered. There are a lot of typologies out there. Most of people will be familiar with Oakeshott, but we also have, for instance, the Gerbig typology, which is absolutely wonderful. Created by Alfred Gerbig, former curator of Saxe-Coburg Museum's collection. Impossible to use unless you literally have an object sitting there in front of you with a set of micrometers. There is no way that you can sort of define whether it's a type 9 or type 7 and so on. So I wanted something which was easy to do visually. Likewise, simple enough that there weren't hundreds of different classification groups. AVB Norman, for instance, created a wonderful typology work for the rapier and smallsword, which goes up to something like type 169. So nobody can remember that many. Well, I hope nobody can remember that many. So keep it simple was my thing. It should be easy to apply both from photographic observation and studies of pictures, for instance. A lot of discussion, particularly on early falchions, is using manuscript images. So there's no way you can get exact measurements. As a result, keeping it simple in that sort of term. And lastly, to avoid reinventing the wheel, a lot of elements of it are recycled from Oakeshott's typology. It is predominantly a study of medieval arms, just as Oakeshott has. So we are using all his existing pommels and crosses because there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So if we skip forward one, this has now changed because in the last week or so, I finally sort of bit the bullet. But what it is there is effectively an equation of the blade type, which is either F or M as a prefix, and I've now added K for knife because we have enough evidence of knife-like messers. If I reach forward, small knife-size objects like this are, that should be visible, much smaller than a sword-size object and are a separate entity in themselves. An N for a number. If I just check this. No, I'm going the wrong way. There we go. A type number which determines which type of blade it is. A detail for the curvature. This is the point where previously Oakeshott was stuck at, and I think I sort of managed to find a solution. If you simply tried to list all the different shapes and curvatures of blades, you would have hundreds of variants. Instead, what we've done is use a terminology, just a plus or a double plus for more pronounced curvature, as a simple shorthand to summarize a degree of curvature. Without that, it would be almost impossible to create any sort of coherent typology. Then we have the cross, which is based off Oakeshott's typology. So that is a specific style, so a style 7 cross or a style 9. A pommel, which is, again, Oakeshott's forms. So form A, form B, form T, and so on, which has been added to because there are specific types which are unique to single-edged arms. And if I just skip forward, that should be the end of that part if you want to skip it back to full screen. So what we have here is a relatively straightforward set of criteria. I'll go into more of that in a little detail. But because of the details of single-edged arms, what we're looking at is very simple classification groups. So we can put them into families and describe each of the separate areas. As I mentioned, Herbert Seitz, he mentions there are two styles. I've been able to go through somewhere in the region of about 5,000 to 7,000 manuscript images. We've gone through, I'm not sure how many museums, and we've found probably in the region of about 30 falchions which exist worldwide. They are extremely rare. There's probably more fakes, in fact, than there are real ones, which makes it quite difficult to be able to study these. As a result of that, the work has then expanded a little further to address the later periods, where you start having more single-edged arms, which are the messers, the single-edged arms of Eastern Europe. They're quite often described as German. That's a description I don't really feel is accurate any longer. They are in Germanic nations, but they are also to be found in Hungary, in Slovenia, in the Ukraine, and even as far as Iceland. So they're a very widespread fashion. And in fact, they're far more common than falchions are. As a matter of equivalence, I would probably say there are 20 to 30 messers in various museums for every one falchion which exists. At a most cynical point of view, I suspect the reality is that there are even more messers. So as a result, the typology has had to evolve a little over time to accommodate studying both of these. There's no point in studying half of the subject and missing out something which goes alongside them. If I go back to the screen share, I can explain a little of those blade types. That's okay, leave it there. Nope, it's not behaving, is it? Again, technical difficulties. Right. And I keep going the wrong way. My mouse is back to front. This is being strange, isn't it? There we go. So what we have there are 5 principal groups which I've been able to identify, which unsurprisingly are called type 1 to type 5, with subgroups which are A, B, C, D, and so on. This is designed so that if there are future scholars, they can identify further groups and add to it quite easily. So if there is a group which I've missed out, it can be shoehorned in without having to have a huge problem of fitting it in. Now, you should be able to see my mouse, hopefully. So I'm pointing in the region. So at the very top of here, we have type 1As. They are the archetypical falchion of the early medieval era. They appear probably around 1230, give or take, 10 years either side. And they continue on for roughly about a century. But you get various other types of broad, fundamentally cleaving weapons, which can be identified as separate types. You get these cut-off square-ended types, which are often found alongside the types of scalloped tips, type C, in, for instance, the Morgan Bible or Maciejowski Bible, on knife-like hilts. I quite often describe these as being a proto-messer, in that if a falchion is constructed with a sword-like hilt, that is, with a cross-guard, a grip, and a pommel pinned at the end, these are mounted in the same way that a knife was at the time, with a whittle tang which is glued into place or bonded into position. And later on, the traditional messer is made just the same as a table knife was, because these are a knife-like tradition. There are quite a few discussions in academia over the nature of the the manufacture of these. For some time, we were wondering whether there was competition between different guilds, for instance. We haven't been able to find sufficient evidence to prove that. And someday, I hope somebody will be daft enough to do their PhD on medieval litigation and be able to go through the surviving court rolls from those periods, and we might actually find some evidence of that. Until that point, unfortunately, it's going to have to be speculation, and my medieval German is definitely not good enough to be able to do that. So those are various types of knife and hilt. And finally, we get a fourth version where you start to see an extension of a point and a change of design philosophy to a broader cutting blade which has a focal point in it, which is then evolved further, if I go the right way, hey, who would have thought it, into these, the Type 2, which is almost back to front. People expect your cutting edge to be on the longer curve of the blade. I shall gesticulate for a second. If a blade has a blunt edge and a sharp edge, which I'm strangely not going to smack, you expect that to be shorter than the long edge or the true edge of the blade. In these examples, you find that the short edge is the one which is sharpened. They often have a very pronounced break point where it curves back into a point which is often reinforced and stiffened. These first appear around 1300. They're relatively short-lived, and they're pretty much extinct by about 1370. We do have one image which suggests the use of those with a knife-like hilt, but it is a single image, and I'll discuss the matter of those in a little bit. So mostly falchions. We then have Type 3s, where you take that principle of a cutaway or a scallop or clip pointed edge. It starts off very broad, a heavy cutter, very similar to the Type 1s. And over time, you see them turning to a long clip point with a stiff point, and then elongating further, becoming more gracile and narrow. And these Type 3B and 3Cs are transitional through the 13th and 14th centuries. Into the 15th century, you then get very short clip points, which are sometimes described as a cat's claw and are often found on messers in the 15th century. And finally, you have multiple clip points, which you see at the bottom, a Type E, which is a very exaggerated form with multiple scallops, usually 2, sometimes 3, and these appear most commonly in messers, in art, but in manuscript images and 1 or 2 rare surviving examples in falchions as well. As I said, the single-edged arms are not solely Germanic. They spread throughout the whole of Europe. And Type 4 in particular are the groups which are associated with the more Eastern European influences. They are often what I would describe as stepped. You can see a clear notch line in your blade spine. And often that is then raised so that you have a false edge, which is very similar to the Turkish yelman in the examples of Type A and Type C. Or you have steps down and a straight blade, which are Type B, and a double step in the body, which is a Type D. I may consider adding a 5th version to this group, which is stepped with a clip point. There are a few examples of these, but I generally try to aim for classification to have sufficient body of evidence that it can be repeated rather than being very rare one-off or unique examples. And at this point in time, I'm not confident that that should be classed as a common type as opposed to just an oddity. And finally, we have a relatively straightforward form, which I've been recently adding to, which is the straight-bladed types, which are quite often found on single-edged swords. There's a much larger body of single-edged arms than just falchions, which are simply called single-edged swords. There's no clear differentiation of what makes a falchion to a single-edged sword. So I am left with these as a group, classifying them because the terminology is too vague to be able to say this is a falchion or this is a sword. As a result, you have types which are fundamentally parallel bladed with a tip which curves upwards to meet the spine. Second type, group B, which are almost a spear point on a parallel blade, and a much more tapering form where the true edge slides upwards to join the point, usually just above the center line. I've been recently doing a lot of work with the surviving examples from Slovenia. There was recently an excellent paper published in 2019 on the subject of surviving examples from that region. The river Ljubljana, I'm pronouncing this wrong, is a wonderful site for archaeological preservation. It flooded regularly, it was often very marsh-like, and as a result, brilliant conditions for the preservation of archaeological objects. In that sort of context, iron survives perfectly, and there's a very wide range of surviving examples. I talked briefly about the knife-like blades, a type K prefix, and the final two, which you can see in this image, are recent additions which I've been looking at. I was originally thinking that these were almost one-off or unique items, but I've been seeing enough of them that I feel that they need to be included in the typology. So I've literally added this piece last night. The first is what I would describe as a bellied blade, where the spine is curved and the cutting edge is curved, forming almost a leaf-like blade. Whereas the second form is almost a broken back, where the hilt bevels at a very obtuse angle into the blade. Often the blades of these are very curved, making them probably hunting knives or something along these lines. These are often found containing nagel, which I'll mention later. So they are messers of a type, although they aren't of the large fighting messer size. So this raises a couple of questions for me as to how these should be classified, but they are certainly single-edged arms of the messer groups which need to be considered. So this is where the typology is still an organic and living document, and I am adding work to it as I speak at this moment to try to classify these and work out how they should be best represented for the study of single-edged arms. And I'm going to go into a little detour of that at that point. No, leave it at that. Shall we go to the archaeology camera? So for my work, if we're lucky, if we skip cameras, we have a number of archaeological originals. As I said, there are only about 20 surviving falchions worldwide. So as a result, strangely enough, I don't own one, but I've been incredibly fortunate to have been able to be loaned a couple of examples and be given a number of examples in trades and the likes by people. And what you have here are these, if I'm just checking the camera, yes, there is a bit of distortion with the lens, so be aware that if I put that side on, you'll probably see it's warped, and if I put it over here, it's warped in the other direction. So there is a fisheye lens going on here, so don't take what you're seeing as exactly spot on for reality. These fighting knives of 15th century medieval Europe are incredibly widespread. They are found under multiple names. They're quite commonly known as Bauernwehr or Hauswehr in German. They're also known as Tasak in Poland and Hungary, for instance, or the Czech Republic, which means tusk. And we can only assume that that is very much a case that it's describing it as fighting like a boar's tusk or something along those lines. The characteristic detail of all of these knives is what you can see at the side here, which is a side guard. If I put the white there, you should be able to see it clearly, which is called a nagel or a nail. It's literally a piece hammered through which sits, and if I pull out a replica, sits at the side to protect your hand. It's one of the characteristics of a fighting knife rather than a civilian knife. If you looked at table knives of the same period, they don't have that feature. These are very, very simple utilitarian items. So if I use this example, this is Austrian and it was found, if you give us half a second, in the Elmslie, which is just on the edge of the Austrian-German border. You should be able to see here that it is quite complex ground. There is a false edge, which is ground to a steep bevel. There is a partial bevel to a fixed spine. Let me just angle this up to be better. But what's quite important is the fact that the back side is absolutely flat. It's just been ground out flat on a piece of metal, forged on one side. Probably just an hour or two's work at most by a skilled smith making a batch of these. There's no slow and steady work going on here. It's a much simpler type of weapon than a sword, for instance. This example, which is slightly corroded, and therefore I have to be very careful, has a very subtle clip point. It's almost impossible to see on a camera, but when measured, but in cross section, the back edge, I'm trying to get a reflection, there we go. The back edge is absolutely flat. The cutting edge has a convex curve, which just indicates it was just ground very simply on a wheel to shape once it had been forged. The absolute minimum of work. And this is a very good indicator of what the social strata of these are. I have here a replica. If we go to camera 1, or whatever it is, camera 0, we have here a replica of one of the falchions. There are, oh, yeah, sorry, no, it's all back to front. People are sometimes talking about falchions being peasant weapons because they're axe-like and all of this, and the evidence is quite the opposite. What we have here is based on the Cluny falchion, which was found in the River Seine near Paris. And it has an absolutely beautiful pommel, which was cast in bronze with a symbol of a castle. There are some theories or hypotheses that the castle is a symbol of fealty, that an item like this is a knightly weapon to present to somebody to show your fealty. And this is backed up by one of the most famous of the falchions, which is the Conyers falchion, a very similar piece, just a bit larger, which is incredibly difficult to get to because it sits in Durham Cathedral and they will not let you touch it because it killed a dragon. Absolutely. You believe that, you'll believe anything. But the Conyers falchion for a good 600 years was what is called a sword of tenure. And it was brought to each of the bishops of Durham Cathedral by the descendants of the person who supposedly killed that dragon, to prove their fealty by presenting the falchion that slew the Sockburn worm. And this sort of tradition of presentation is quite common. And so these are clear indications of falchions being very high class. And most of the ones which survive, even though they've been pulled out of rivers or the likes, show beautiful quality of decoration. And this sort of undermines this myth that the falchion was a low-class object. Whereas what we were looking at a few moments ago, the Banner and Tassac, this sort of style of piece, are very, very simple, straightforward items which were lower class. I believe that much of the research problem has been that these two groups have been thrown together, and the assumption of one has been applied to the other, and vice versa. And as a result, we've got mixed messages over time. So if I go back to sitting backwards for a few seconds, how long have we got, by the way?
25 minutes.
25, right. In effect, there we go. What we're looking at is a very, very complex picture of surviving archaeology of different social classes. So understanding the subject matter is a question of how we can understand society. People talk about the issues of whether peasants were able to wear weapons, for instance. And the reality is that items such as this were absolutely typical of their day. The cities often had city gates with an iron chain, where a wrought iron sort of forged object would be hung from that chain, so that you could compare your weapon to it. And if it was too large, then you were required to surrender your weapon, in effect. Whereas if it was small enough, then you were expected to be able to carry that around in public for the entire time. Conversely, at the same time, the citizens who lived in the city were expected to own weapons and armor. I believe that one of our speakers yesterday touched on this subject. Sarah B. Tusley's the martial ethic in medieval and early modern Germany, I believe is the title of the book, covers this in fantastic detail, how the weapon showings, as the term was, of the period would have the citizen burghers expected to turn up in full equipment, in armor, to show that they were capable of defending the city in time of war. And so they would be expected to own all of these sort of pieces of items and equipment. It's a contradiction in terms, and we need to study this subject of society better to understand the sword. One of the reasons I suspect that the messer became popular is it's very much a curved or a cutting blade rather than a thrusting weapon. Yeah, let's switch to that for a second. If we jump, is it jumping? There we go. Skip a bit, Brother Maynard. Items like this. This was an archaeological river find from Croatia, very similar to the Slovenian ones, which I've been studying recently. Has a broken tip, unfortunately, so it probably was about that much longer. But it was probably curved and slightly rounded. It might have had a little bit of a clip point. We can't really tell. But it's fundamentally a cutting weapon. And if you then look at the subject of medieval German laws, you find that in the case of an altercation, you were expected to defend yourself, such that if you stabbed somebody, it was considered attempted murder. But if you cut them, it was defense. Unless they're Italian, because, you know, they're filthy foreign Italian people and you just kill them. If they're a citizen, you have to show that you have protected yourself. And obviously, a weapon which is optimized in use of a cut is possibly preferable for that. So one of my suspicions is that part of the rise of the popularity of the Messer was because it is a weapon optimized for cutting rather than thrusting. If that is the case, then that would explain a lot of the rise and the fact that social strata changed. These started off with small knives in the turn of the 15th century, being very much a lower class weapon. By 1450, you start seeing them in the hands of middle class individuals. By the end of the 15th century, they are being gifted to princes. So there is a clear progression of climb of social strata. And at the same point, you then start getting items like this beautiful, delicate little Messer. If I get the angle right. Move. And this is most likely what was called a Jagdmesser, a hunting messer. And you can see at the side, incredibly small pommel, very small cross, the hand, single-handed grip. But the blade is extremely stiff all the way through. It's still 4 millimeters down here. So it runs from about 6.5 to 4. Very, very stiff item, which is exactly what you would want if you were a hunter trying to do a thrust. And it's heavily corroded, but the edge is not particularly keen. So either this has been very heavily worn away, which I don't believe, or it was predominantly something for stabbing. Oh, I'm sorry, my hands are moving in the wrong direction. So this raises questions. This is a hunting tool. This is a high-class status object. It probably would have had antler for the grips here, which is suited for stabbing, which is contradictory to the entire subject of these as a civilian or a civic item. So there are still areas which need to be studied to get a better understanding of what is going on with single-edged arms. And I shall now move back so that you can suffer my face again. All in all, this is an ongoing subject. It's going to take many more years. My intention is that eventually we'll end up with a book on the subject. There are a few quiet sort of plans in the background of how we might be able to manage that. But this research is slow. It means traveling to places literally worldwide. There are messers, as I mentioned, in Iceland, which were most likely part of the Hansa trade network. There are messers in Romania and Slovenia and Verfaust, Italy and Paris, everywhere, which we are going to have to fund, going to have to finally afford to travel to and create a book which will be on par with Urtjogschot's records of medieval sword, cataloguing these so that there is finally a published detailed study of these in all of their varied types. I think we've probably got about 15 minutes left. Let me just check that. Yes, slightly more. So what I was planning to do was, that's what I'm doing. And hopefully I've got a few questions which I can be asked by people who are interested in this sort of subject, and I can go into that into a little bit more detail.
Yes. So that's fascinating, James. It really is. I learned a lot about that there. And yeah, no. So we did have some questions that were. Let me see what I can find here. Do you have a hypothesis for why there are so few surviving falchions?
Ooh, rabbit hole.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, this is one of the big questions. If you take a look at the manuscripts, then I roughly speaking, I went through about 7,000 manuscript images. Roughly 1 in 20 contains depictions of a falchion, which is problematic. Because if there were 1 in 20 surviving medieval swords was a falchion, you would have hundreds of them, and we don't. And this is a paradox. It's a contradiction in terms. I mentioned society, and part of society at that time was the predominance of the theological construct, the idea of the all-consuming idea of God. When we study medieval arms, Peter Johnson spoke about this yesterday in his fabulous talk, the concept of geometry and how it is applied to a cathedral, and it's applied to a sword in the same sort of way, could be applied to a sword in the same sort of way. If we then read something like, for instance, Clement of Alexandria, he writes, blah, 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 the two-edged sword of God. And it's a phrase which keeps appearing again and again in theological work, the two-edged sword. It's not the sword of God. And that sort of sends a little jingling bell in the back of the head. So I suspect that what is going on, if you look at the archaeology of the pre-medieval or the early medieval period, you have lots of single-edged objects, single-edged swords, and you get saxes and things like that. They, particularly in Britain, it's a very good example. They almost die out in almost like an extinction event, somewhere around 1050. And it's very tempting to think that it may be slightly later and around 1066, in which case it is a decline because the Saxon culture is being suppressed to a degree by the Normans who are coming in, who have a different sort of philosophy of thought. And if that's the case, it could well be that the single-edged sword is considered almost profane. It's unchristian. And if you then take a look at those manuscript images where all the depictions are, you start looking, you start spotting patterns. Who's holding that sword? It's Goliath, or it's Philistines, or it's Romans at the crucifixion. In many, many cases, the depiction of a falchion is an element of the unchristian. You show them in the hands of the baddies. In a way, it's like the 1950s Westerns, where the baddie has the black hat, but the good guy has the white hat. And in this way, I think that the manuscript depictions are a visual shorthand or a metaphor for the unchristian. And that continues into later periods, where you see the depiction of single-edged arms, curved swords, in the hands of the Arab forces in the Crusades. even though actual Arab swords at the time were straight side of it being an unchristian object. So in many ways, I think that there is an association going on there, that the single-edged sword had a stigma, a sort of a disapproval amongst the righteous and Christian. And someday I hope we'll find more evidence that can prove that. But there's enough circumstantial evidence there that I believe that's plausible.
So this next question is more of the design of the blade. It says, especially the I think it was your type 3s we get into, is there any speculated use for the scalloped points?
It's not really certain. It may simply be they look good. You do find quite a few examples where they're very, very exaggerated. And it does raise a question, are these almost a back spike for sort of punching into armor and things like that? And I feel it's unlikely. It's a possibility, but I think that mostly it's a weight saving, because you're cutting off weight, giving yourself a second false edge so that you've got a bit more adaptability. And it may possibly be in fencing terms where it gives you something to bind with. But generally speaking, I think that they're mostly a design aesthetic rather than a mechanical function.
So Ryan Renfro asks, he says, "Hi James, sorry to hear your aspirations to the episcopacy of Durham continue to be thwarted."
They have offered that I can look at it.
Ooh.
Ooh, wow. This is actually further than even the Royal Armouries have got.
Wow.
The Royal Armouries tried to get requests to do a study, and they weren't even allowed to take a peek at it.
Wow.
But I'm holding out. I figure that it's been there for the last 700 odd years. I can wait a few years to keep poking them, and if I'm lucky, they'll finally let me hold it as well. At that point, I can measure all the details, which I really need to. But anyway, you were saying.
He continues, says, "Do you have any thoughts on how the dynamic properties of single-edged swords compare with that of two-edged swords?"
It's a tricky one because there's such a wide variation. If I just glove up again, don't worry, I'll keep on this one. For something like this, with the blade, it is very much mass oriented, even though there isn't a lot of weight in these. This one is about 870 grams, I think it is. So that's less than 1.5 pounds, I think. You'll have to check your imperial measurements yourself. It is extremely thin. It's only about 1.2 millimeters. And as a result, there is very little resistance in this cut. In comparison, you take a look at something like the Castellan Horde falchions or the Storta in the Metropolitan Museum. They are much more of a conventional sword-like item. So I don't think there's any one sort of rule which covers every single type. Each one really has to be given an assessment in its own right to be able to properly sort of explain them. I think that there's too much variation there to really sort of make a clear argument for it. I hope.
John Dowdle asks, he says, "I have questions about the design of falchions in Messer and how they're related to scimitar and Bowie knives."
Ooh.
You feel that?
I can add to that real quick, if it's okay. What I'm looking at is this, because I'm a 20th century collector of military knives and military survival knives. The Bowie knife is that classic American design, but it also, I think you talked a little bit about it on the falchion with, as far as a relation to the scimitar a little bit, some potential influence. But from a more modern perspective, James Black, the Arkansas blacksmith, it's more of a legend, but he totally came up with what they call the clip point buoy design. But to me, it looks like a shortened version of some of the falchion or messers. And
Yeah.
I didn't know if you had seen anything related to that. I was more curious if you'd come across any research.
I have seen knife-sized messers, tiny, dinky, beautiful things with clip points that would not be out of place on a relatively modern Bowie. The clip point in itself is. Oh, sorry.
David is waving one around.
Right. Sorry, I couldn't quite see on the screen there. Thank you. Yeah. You also get clip points like that on saxes, which are 9th and 10th century. There are a couple from York as an example of that, which are absolutely beautiful little things. I don't feel that the Bowie is a new knife in any way. The primary principle of the clip point as a design has gone back for 1,000 years. The only innovation of the Bowie in many ways is the adding of a small guard to protect from sliding forward compared to the sax. So I feel that there's much more of a convergent evolution, or possibly what could be described an Elvis taxon, in that these all end up becoming lookalikes of each other. In comparison with that, the falchion to the scimitar or the shamshir, I don't feel that there is much in the way of interrelation there. The falchion itself seems to have developed on its own in France or northern Italy, the Lombard region, where there isn't sufficient sort of DNA crossover with the early curved sabers of, for instance, the Avar, and it predates the Islamic swords. Ansal Yücel is the author who created a fantastic book on Arabic swords and swordsmiths, particularly in the Topkapi Museum. And the earliest dated example of a curved sword blade of that culture is, I believe, 1297. So roughly 60, 70 odd years before the earliest falchions, or sorry, after the earliest falchions appeared. So I don't feel that there's influence being going on there.
Our friends over at Landsknecht Emporium, hey guys, they make great stuff. By the way,
At this point, I'll just say yes. I'm wearing your T-shirt.
I have a couple of older knives that they made. I don't think they offer the knives anymore that I have of theirs, and they're great. I love them. But they asked, says, I think we talked about this before, but what do you think about the possible connection between Eastern messers, type 16 cross, and Basillards, especially concerning the early in the wood nagels and the nailed on crosses on some Basillards?
Well, this is one of the Basillards. Let me just move some of these to the side and out of the way. Now, I mentioned those type 5 D&Ds, the ones which I've recently added. And the most telling piece for association with that is the construction of the scabbards. The scabbards of the messer-like knives almost mirror, in a smaller scale, these steel frame constructions on large Basillards, which are of either Swiss or Italian fashion. This one, bit of both. As a result, I think that there is a definite link going on there, and that the complexity of the scabbards is showing that there is a connection going on there. At the very least, that there is trade, that these have been shipped from probably primary manufacturing points in Passau, and they've headed south into areas like Slovenia and they've headed into Hungary and related countries around that area. So I'm pretty confident that there's something going on there.
We have Andrew Fraser, who's speaking next, asks you, what's your opinion on the lengthening of knives to circumvent sword prohibition laws in late medieval Europe?
Rubbish. Yeah. I personally think that it's a modern conceit. We have a habit of projecting our own mentality onto things, and it's very difficult to avoid. People naturally have their modern conceits of things. So we have this idea of sticking it to the man by sort of breaking the rules and all of that sort of stuff. And it doesn't really sort of add up for the medieval period. As I mentioned, you often had a chain hanging beside the city gates with a blade on it. And it wasn't the shape of the blade, it was the size. Some of them were just almost like a yardstick, showing that you could have, 15 inches or whatever of blade, and you'd get past. So the whole sort of, oh no, officer, this is a knife, not a sword. It got popular about 10, 15 years ago, I think, in sort of various circles. But I think it's more of a reflection on modern society than it is a understanding of medieval.
All right, we have one more question. This is my question from me, the big question asked to all of our speakers. What is your favorite sword?
I could talk for another hour, easily.
Yeah, because Andrew's coming up next, and he specifically
Yeah.
did not fall asleep this time.
Yeah, I'm amazed. I would have thought he'd been snoozing the entire time. The one which still tempts me is what's called the boy's sword. It's Solingen. I can screen share a picture of it if you like. It is the most beautiful little sword. It's barely a meter long. It's long sword proportions, but it's constructed like a messer. It has scales on the tang, and the guard has actually been slid from the point up to the guard and then pinned through, just like a messer. So it's a fascinating sort of hybrid of both of these, and I'd love to make a reproduction of it someday, either as it is, real size, or think about how a modern interpretation of it being produced at longsword size for somebody to be able to use it who isn't a child would be fascinating, I think. And that's one of the ones which is certainly on my hit list. And otherwise, if anyone happens to want to work as a distraction, then I've got plans for how we can break into Durham Cathedral and steal a certain falchion. No, that's probably the best.
Well, all right. Well, that was an excellent talk. That was fantastic. I really was. I know you don't think it was, but it was.
Have we got a team going?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We go in, we work in groups, we distract the security guards. While the security guards are distracted, what I do is I get to the glass cabinet and I'm going to use a LiDAR scanner and scan the thing in full 3D so I can 3D print it later. And that way I've stolen it without them proving anything.
I teach you how to use photogrammetry, which is what we're using for the mobile museum exhibit app. So basically you go and you're like, oh, I just want to take pictures. And you just think about
they don't allow pictures. It might steal the thing. So hence I need a team of people. So thank you for volunteering, all of you. We now need alibis.
I'm in the US, that's my alibi. So anyway, James, thank you so much for giving this talk today. That was fantastic.
You're welcome. I hope it's been fun for everybody.
Yeah, if what you have a website where you post information periodically or sporadically, right?
Sort of. It needs renewing at the moment. So,
all right.
Yeah. What we have done is recently, I should thank at this point Steve Gowans, who is the guy behind the scenes who's been switching the cameras and the likes. Can you tell he's an audio engineer by the way he set it all up? And the group which we've been working there with is a arts collective in Perth in Scotland called.
Ah, there we go.
So there you go. And eventually some of my work will get put onto that website as well.
Next week.
You'll be able to tell if it's on because I'll be limping, having had my kneecaps broken. Yeah. But yes.
Thank you to James. Thank you to Steve. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back for Andrew Fraser, and he's going to be giving his talk, The Good Guy with the Sword, Violence in the Medieval Cities. So we'll be back in 5 minutes, folks.
Thanks, James.